2:15 in the morning, middle of the Atlantic Ocean. An Airbus A330 is cruising smooth at 35,000 feet when suddenly, bang, the autopilot kicks off. The cockpit erupts with alarms. The aircraft banks hard right, and in the next 4 minutes, this state-of-the-art jet is going to fall 38,000 feet straight into the black ocean below. My friend, let me tell you, what you're about to hear is one of the most haunting stories in modern aviation history. And here's the thing, every single person on board had absolutely no idea what was coming. So how does a perfectly good aircraft just fall out of the sky? What chain of events turned a routine overnight flight into a nightmare? And why didn't 3 experienced pilots, sitting right there in the cockpit, see it coming until it was way too late? Look, this is another story about warning signs that were ignored for years. And tonight, I'm going to walk you through every single second of what happened up there in the darkness. Because this one changed everything we thought we knew about flying modern jets. I'm Captain Peter Mercer. I've been flying for 25 years, and what you're about to hear is this story told from a pilot's point of view. Welcome aboard, my friend. Buckle up, you're going to need it for this one. All right, let's set the stage here. May 31st, 2009, Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Air France Flight 447 is getting ready for the long haul back to Paris. Now, this wasn't just any flight. This was a flagship route for Air France, operated with one of their most advanced aircraft, an Airbus A330-203. This particular bird had been delivered brand new in 2005, just 4 years old, and it was in pristine condition. We are talking about a jet packed with the latest fly-by-wire technology, computerized flight controls, and every safety system you could imagine. The flight was scheduled to depart at 8:00 p.m. local time, that's 11:00 p.m. Paris time, which meant the crew was going to be flying through the entire night. When you're crossing the Atlantic westbound like this, you're basically asking your body to stay awake when every cell is screaming for sleep. That's what we call the circadian low, my friend, and it's brutal. Your reaction time slows down, your decision-making gets foggy, and let me tell you, that matters when things go wrong. Because of the length of this flight, 12 hours and 45 minutes, Air France had augmented the crew with an extra pilot. So we've got 3 guys up front, 1 captain and 2 first officers. Now let me break down who these pilots were, because this is important. The captain was 58 years old, very experienced guy. He had 11,000 total flight hours under his belt, and 1,700 of those hours were as pilot in command on the A330. This was a man who knew his aircraft inside and out. He'd been evaluated as very high standard by Air France, top of his game. The first officer, the younger guy, was 32 years old. He was the least experienced of the 3 with 3,000 total hours and 800 on the A330. He'd only gotten his type rating on this aircraft the year before in 2008. He was still building his experience, you know? But here's something kinda interesting. He'd brought his wife with him on this trip. They'd spent 3 days in Rio together before this flight. So you gotta wonder, was he well rested? Was he? We'll never know for sure. But there were indications that maybe rest wasn't exactly a priority during that layover. The third pilot, I'm going to call him the relief pilot, was 37 years old. He had 6,500 total hours, and get this, he was actually the most experienced on the A330 with 4,500 hours on type. But here's the catch. He'd barely flown in the previous 3 months because he was working a management position at Air France. So yeah, he knew the aircraft, but was he current? That's a different question. The 3 pilots met up before the flight and went through all the standard stuff. Weather briefings, flight plans, NOTAMs, you know, the usual pre-flight routine. The weather looked fine in Rio, fine in Paris. But the en route weather, that was a different story, my friend. See, when you're flying from Rio to Paris, you got to cross the equator. And right there, smack in the middle of the Atlantic, you've got what we call the Intertropical Convergence Zone, the ITCZ. Now let me explain what that is real quick. The ITCZ is where the trade winds from the northern and southern hemispheres collide. All that humid air from the ocean surface gets forced upwards, and you get these massive thunderstorms that can tower up to 60,000 feet. That's way higher than any airliner can fly. So what happens is, you're threading the needle between these huge storm cells, trying to find a path through. And here's the kicker. These storms form over water, which means they can have less water content than storms over land. That makes them harder to see on your weather radar. but they're just as dangerous, sometimes more dangerous, than what you'd see over a continent. The pilots knew this. They discussed it during their briefing. They even took on extra fuel to give themselves options for deviating around the weather. They briefed the 9 cabin crew members about possible turbulence. Everything was done by the book. But here's something the pilots probably didn't focus on during that briefing: the type of precipitation hiding inside those storms. Most people think of thunderstorms and picture rain and hail, right? But when you go higher up into these clouds, especially in the ITCZ, things get weird. You've got these super strong updrafts that can force water droplets way up into freezing cold air. These droplets become supercooled. They're still liquid, but the second they hit any surface, they instantly freeze into clear ice. Sometimes these supercooled droplets collide with snowflakes, and when that happens, you get these soft ice crystals. They're not as hard as hail, but they're big enough that you can hear them pelting the fuselage if you fly through them. Now, this stuff doesn't create the heavy airframe icing that pilots are trained to deal with. But what it does do is clog up sensors and probes on the aircraft. Specifically, it can overwhelm the pitot tubes, those little sensors that measure airspeed. And you know what? This had been happening to Air France flights throughout 2008 and 2009. More than 9 different incidents of pitot tube blockages had been reported. Air France had published safety bulletins about it, circulated them to all their pilots, told them how to recognize it and deal with it. So this wasn't some unknown threat. It was a known issue. In fact, Airbus had been working on the problem. They developed a newer type of pitot tube that was more effective at preventing ice crystal blockages. They'd issued a maintenance bulletin suggesting an upgrade. Air France had just started upgrading their A330 fleet about a month before this flight. And here's the irony that's going to haunt you, my friend. The accident aircraft was scheduled to have its pitot tubes replaced when it arrived in Paris the next day, one day too late. Now you might be wondering, if this was a known problem, why wasn't the pitot tube replacement mandatory? Why was it just a suggestion? Well, that's because the temporary loss of airspeed from ice crystal blockages was considered rare. It only lasted a couple of minutes max, and there was a procedure for dealing with it. Air France called this procedure IAS douteuse, unreliable airspeed. And because this issue had popped up several times, it had been included in recurrent training for all Air France pilots in 2008 and 2009. But here's where things get interesting. The training exercises for unreliable airspeed had only been done at low altitude. That's because low altitude is where it's most critical. You're close to the ground, you've got less margin for error. But the thing is, aircraft performance at low altitude is way better than at high altitude. The engines have more power, the air is thicker, the aircraft is more responsive. Everything's easier down low. And there's another piece of training that's going to matter here: stall recovery. None of the pilots on Flight 447 had received any recent training on how to deal with an approach to stall at high altitude. The last stall training they'd gotten was during their initial type rating on the A320, years earlier. And that training was all done at low altitude, with heavy emphasis on using thrust to power out of the stall. The idea was, add power, minimize altitude loss, don't worry too much about pitching down. That works great at low altitude where the engines have plenty of excess thrust. But at high altitude, that's a whole different ballgame, my friend. Alright, so the 216 passengers finish boarding, the crew is ready. At 10:09 p.m. UTC, that's just 9 minutes behind schedule, the pilots request pushback and start moving away from the gate. The first officer is pilot flying. All 3 pilots are in the cockpit as they taxi out. At 10:29 p.m., the A330 starts rolling down the runway in Rio. The takeoff is completely normal. They climb away on their cleared departure route, heading northeast along the Brazilian coastline. Everything's going smooth. As they pass through 20,000 feet, the relief pilot gets up and heads back to the crew rest compartment behind the cockpit. He's got a 3-hour rest period scheduled. The 2 remaining pilots settle in for the cruise. They get clearance to climb to their initial cruise altitude, flight level 350, that's 35,000 feet. Once they're established in cruise, they're talking to controllers in Brasilia. Then they switch to Recife control. Recife is going to be the last radar controller to have contact with the flight, because once they pass into the next airspace, Atlântico, they'll be beyond radar coverage. From that point on, they'll be using oceanic separation procedures. Now, Flying over oceanic areas requires special training and equipment. Since VHF radio doesn't work over the horizon because of the curvature of the Earth, aircraft use HF radios instead. These radios bounce signals off the ionosphere and can reach much further distances. As the aircraft passes a navigation point called Untold, the pilots check in with Atlantico Control on HF. They also try to log into a new system being tested in the area called ADS-C. This system would use automatic satellite reports to update ATC on the aircraft's position, even without radar coverage. Pretty cool, right? But here's the problem. Due to a formatting error in the flight plan, the pilots can't log in. So once the aircraft leaves conventional radar coverage, it's not going to be accurately tracked anymore. That's going to have serious consequences later, my friend. Now, before we get into what happens next, I need to explain a little bit about how this Airbus works, because it's absolutely critical to understanding this accident. The A330 is what we call a fly-by-wire aircraft. That means when the pilots move the side stick or rudder pedals, those inputs aren't directly connected to the flight controls. Instead, they're electronically interpreted by computers, which then send commands to hydraulic actuators that move the control surfaces. This system has a lot of benefits. It makes the aircraft lighter, but more importantly, it allows the aircraft to monitor safety parameters and prevent the pilots from exceeding them. Things like excessive bank angles, excessive pitch, maximum and minimum speeds, all of these are monitored. And in what's called normal law, the aircraft will actually prevent the pilots from doing anything dangerous. You can't stall the aircraft in normal law. You can't overspeed it. You can't put it into an upset. The computers won't let you. But here's the catch. In order for those protections to work, the computers need to be absolutely sure they're using correct data. If they're not sure, if the sensors are giving conflicting information, the computers will back off. They'll take away those protections and revert to what's called alternate law. In alternate law, the stall protection is gone. The overspeed protection is gone, the bank angle limits are gone, and the roll control becomes about twice as sensitive. The aircraft becomes harder to fly, especially at high altitude, where the thin air provides less aerodynamic damping. The computers get their information from pitot tubes, static ports, inertial reference units, angle of attack vanes, all sorts of sensors. This data is combined in 3 Air Data Reference Units, or ADRs, which together form the Air Data Inertial Reference System. As long as at least 2 of the 3 ADRs agree with each other, the aircraft is happy. It stays in normal law, but if 2 or more ADRs start sending conflicting data, things happen fast. The autopilot disconnects. The auto-throttle disconnects. The flight directors might disappear, and the aircraft degrades from normal law into alternate law. At that point, the aircraft is basically saying to the pilots, "I'm not sure what's going on, you figure it out." And there's one more thing that's really important here. In a conventional aircraft like the Boeing 737 that I fly, when you move the yoke, you're directly controlling the elevators. If you trim the aircraft nose up too much, you'll feel it in the yoke. You'll have to push hard to keep the nose down. There's direct tactile feedback, but in the Airbus, the side stick doesn't work that way. When you set a pitch attitude, the flight computers move the elevators to initiate the pitch, and then the horizontal stabilizer automatically moves to maintain that pitch without any further input. There's no tactile feedback if the aircraft gets into a weird trim situation. In normal law, that's not a problem because the aircraft protects you from getting into a bad situation. But in alternate law, you're on your own, my friend. Alright, so Flight 447 is cruising along at 35,000 feet. The autopilot is flying the aircraft. The 2 pilots up front are relaxed, just monitoring everything. They receive a message from their company, warning them about thunderstorm activity ahead. The first officer changes the scale on his navigation display and starts looking at the weather build-ups. They discuss ways to avoid the worst of the turbulence. The first officer is clearly worried about the storm clouds ahead. At 1:46 a.m., he dims the cockpit lights to see better outside. He confirms they're entering cloud. It's pitch black outside. The moon is behind them, and light turbulence starts rocking the aircraft. They discuss maybe climbing higher to get above the clouds, but when they check their maximum altitude, it's only flight level 370, just 2,000 feet higher than where they are. They decide that's not a good idea. You don't want to be sitting at max altitude if the turbulence gets worse. Now here's something you need to understand about high-altitude flying. As you climb higher, the air gets thinner and thinner. At some point, depending on your weight and the outside temperature, the aircraft reaches its performance ceiling. The engines just don't have enough excess thrust to climb any higher. And because of that, the engines don't have much excess thrust to deal with problems either. You got to be very careful and conservative with how you fly up there. The only way to climb higher than your max altitude would be to trade speed for altitude, exchange kinetic energy for potential energy. But doing that dramatically increases your angle of attack. And at high altitude, the critical angle of attack, the angle where the aircraft will stall, is lower than it is at low altitude, due to aerodynamic effects from flying closer to the speed of sound. So, in short, the aircraft will stall earlier and has less available thrust at high altitude. It's also more sensitive and harder to hand fly because there's less air providing damping. You're walking a tightrope up there. After entering the clouds, the captain starts commenting on St. Elmo's fire. Those eerie electrical discharges you can see dancing on the windscreen. It's a sure sign that they're getting close to storm clouds with heavy electrical activity. Around this time, the captain presses a call button that rings a bell in the crew rest compartment. That's the signal to the relief pilot. Time to come back to the cockpit so the captain can get some rest. The relief pilot knocks on the cockpit wall to acknowledge. Now, according to Air France procedures at the time, when the captain leaves for rest, the first officer in the right seat, who's currently pilot flying, takes on the role of pilot in command unless something else has been agreed. And that's exactly what happens here. When the relief pilot arrives in the cockpit at 1:59 a.m., the captain gets up and listens to the briefing. The first officer tells the relief pilot about the turbulence, the fact that they're in cloud, and that they can't climb any higher right now. The captain doesn't give any specific instructions about handling the weather. He just heads back to the crew rest compartment. Now we can only speculate about why he didn't give more detailed guidance. My guess? All three pilots were experienced with this type of weather. They'd flown this route many times. He probably figured the two first officers could handle it without him. And you know what? Under normal circumstances, they absolutely could have. When the captain leaves, the relief pilot, who's actually much more senior and experienced, takes the left seat as pilot monitoring. The first officer continues as pilot flying and, effectively, pilot in command. They start discussing the weather ahead. The first officer mentions the intertropical convergence zone, but here's the thing. There's no discussion about deviating significantly off course. They're just planning to pick their way through. The relief pilot asks the first officer if he'd been able to sleep during his layover. The first officer mentions the ITCZ again. The relief pilot says he'd only dozed off for a bit. He asks the first officer if he's feeling okay. You can kinda hear the fatigue in their voices, you know? The captain had made similar remarks earlier. These guys are tired. Here's something interesting. The relief pilot leaves his seat in the aft position when he sits down. He doesn't move it forward into the proper flying position. That would have given him a more relaxed posture where he could put his feet up, but it wouldn't be ideal if he suddenly needed to take controls, which he's about to need to do. At 2:06 a.m., the first officer contacts the cabin crew to warn them about possible light turbulence and to tell them to be careful with the service. It's now 4 minutes since the captain left, and in another 4 minutes, everything's gonna go to hell. The relief pilot starts looking more closely at his navigation display. He reaches down and changes the weather radar gain to max, making it more sensitive. The weather ahead lights up on his screen. He asks the first officer if maybe they should go a bit to the left. The first officer asks what he means. The relief pilot points at the returns on the screen and asks again about turning left. The first officer agrees and turns the heading bug about 12 degrees left. That's a pretty small deviation given the amount of weather in front of them, but it means they're now leaving their planned route, and they don't tell ATC about this course change. At 2:08:17, the cockpit voice recorder picks up a change in background noise. It sounds like rain hitting the cockpit. At the same time, the first officer notices the temperature is going up. He asks if the relief pilot did something with the air conditioning. Then he asks, "What's that smell?" The relief pilot recognizes it immediately. Ozone. He calms his colleague down, explains what it is. These observations, the precipitation outside, the smell of ozone, the temperature and humidity change, They're all signs of what's happening. The aircraft is flying into a massive concentration of water and ice crystals. The change in temperature felt in the cockpit is probably from a huge amount of ice being sucked into the engines, partially overwhelming the air conditioning system. 20 seconds later, the background noise intensifies. Now it sounds like ice crystals pelting the cockpit. The turbulence gets worse. The first officer reduces their commanded speed from Mach 0.82 to 0.8. That's the turbulence penetration speed. The autothrottle reduces thrust back to 84% N1. Up until this point, everything's been working perfectly. The two pilots are relaxed, just monitoring the autopilot doing its job. But we're about to hit the critical moment, my friend. We don't know for sure what caused it, but it's very likely that those ice crystals battering the aircraft started to overwhelm the heating elements on the pitot tubes. These tubes are providing crucial airspeed information to the 3 air data modules, and when they get blocked, all hell breaks loose. At 2:10:05, the autopilot and autothrottle suddenly disconnect. The cavalry charge warning, da-da-da-da, blares in the cockpit. At the exact same moment, a heavy gust of wind causes the aircraft to start banking sharply to the right. The first officer calls out, "I have controls," and reaches for his side stick. Now this sudden onset of warnings and aircraft movement would have caused a severe startle to both pilots. The confusion sets in almost immediately, but at this point the aircraft is still flying reasonably level. It's just this right bank developing. As the aircraft continues banking right, the indicated airspeed on the captain's display, as well as on the standby indicator, suddenly drops from 275 knots to 60 knots. That's a clearly erroneous indication. We don't know for sure what the first officer's instruments showed because they weren't recorded, but they likely dropped by a similar amount. Remember what I told you about how the altimeter system compensates for speed? Well, because the speed is now reading much lower, the altimeter recalculates and suddenly shows a drop of 300 feet and a negative vertical speed. The altitude is dropping, or at least that's what the instruments say. The first officer, who's been suddenly thrown into hand-flying the aircraft, reacts instinctively. He gives left aileron to stop the right bank, and he pulls back to correct his altitude. That pullback, that's the start of the sequence that's going to doom this flight, my friend. Since all 3 ADRs are now showing unreliable data, the aircraft reverts to alternate law. The angle of attack protections are gone. The overspeed protection is gone. The bank angle limits are gone. And remember what I said about roll control becoming more sensitive? Yeah, that's happening now. The first officer has to really concentrate to stop the aircraft from banking. He starts overcorrecting, right, then left, then right again. But here's the thing. While he's focused on stopping the bank, the pitch is increasing. The aircraft is climbing fast. Almost as soon as the autopilot disconnects, a brief stall warning sounds in the cockpit. When it sounds, the relief pilot calls out, "What is that?" Maybe because it was so quick. Or maybe, and this is scary to think about, maybe he doesn't immediately recognize what it means. The flight directors, those command bars that show pilots how to fly, the procedure says to turn them off when you get unreliable airspeed. But the crew doesn't do that. The command bars disappear anyway due to lack of reliable data, but they're going to come back in a really unhelpful way in a minute. 11 seconds into this sequence, the aircraft pitch has reached 11 degrees nose up. The first officer is making maximum left and right side stick inputs, overcorrecting like crazy. He calls out, we haven't got a good display." He's noticing the lack of speed information. The relief pilot is supposed to be handling the warnings and reading the checklists. He calls out, "We've lost the speeds," and "alternate law, protection law," but he's reading it all in a rushed, hard-to-understand manner. Here's where it would have been absolutely critical to clearly state, "We are in alternate law. The aircraft will handle differently. Certain protections are lost." But that doesn't happen. He mentions that the auto thrust is lost. The first officer responds by asking, "Engine lever?" He's confused about what's being said. Since the autothrottle disconnected, the thrust has gone into a mode called engine thrust locked. It's keeping the previous value of 84%. The ECAM says to manually move the thrust levers to resume control, but instead, the first officer pushes the autothrottle disconnect button and leaves the lever where it is, in the climb detent. So now the thrust starts increasing to climb power. All of this, everything I just described, happened in the first 18 seconds. There are 10 different warnings showing up, each one causing a chime. The master warning and master caution lights are lit up. There's a constant C chord chime indicating they've left their assigned altitude. This would be an incredibly confusing and stressful environment for anyone. And here's the problem. Unreliable airspeed is not indicated on the ECAM. The pilots have to figure that out themselves. And they're not doing it. At 2:10:26, 26 seconds into this nightmare, the aircraft pitch has reached 12 degrees nose up. They're climbing at 6,900 feet per minute. That's more than 7 times their normal climb rate. They pass through 36,000 feet. Maintaining this climb rate means the aircraft is rapidly trading speed for altitude. They're bleeding energy. Suddenly, the flight directors come back. But instead of being in altitude hold like they were before, they're now in vertical speed mode. They're commanding the pilots to maintain the current 6,000 feet per minute climb. That's the last thing they need right now. The first officer is getting more and more overloaded by noise and workload. This is exactly why the unreliable airspeed procedure says to turn off the flight directors. The relief pilot looks away from the ECAM, which he'd stopped reading anyway, and switches on the wing anti-ice. That's when he notices the high pitch. He calls out, "Watch your speed," maybe referring to the vertical speed since the airspeed indication still hasn't come back. The first officer replies, "Okay, I'm going back down," and starts pitching forward. But not nearly enough. This only reduces the climb rate a bit. The aircraft is still climbing. The relief pilot keeps calling out, "Stabilize! Go back down! According to all three, you are going up, so go back down." The first officer responds, "Okay." The pitch reduces to about 10 degrees nose up, which still gives them 4,000 feet per minute climb. They pass through their calculated max altitude of 37,000 feet. At 2:10:36, the flight directors disappear again. But now the airspeed comes back on the left side, showing 223 knots. That means they've lost about 50 knots and they're still losing speed. The flight directors flash up again for a second, disappear, then come back, commanding a 1,400 feet per minute climb, which is what the aircraft is doing. At 2:10:47, 42 seconds into this, the first officer inexplicably reduces thrust back to 85% N1. This is likely a sign of his increasing loss of situational awareness. He's becoming disoriented. The relief pilot pushes the call button, trying to get the captain back. He presses it several times. Where is he? He also reaches over and switches the air data selector and attitude heading selector to position 3. These switches change the data source for the displays. They're not part of any checklist. He's probably trying to restore the missing instruments. 3 seconds later, the stall warning goes off, and it sounds continuously for the next 45 seconds. The fact that this warning is now sounding continuously, that's not verbalized, it's not discussed. Instead, the first officer reacts by pulling back on the controls, increasing pitch to 16 degrees nose up. That's a takeoff attitude. This pullback also causes the horizontal stabilizer to move into maximum nose-up position, making recovery even harder. The aircraft no longer has enough energy to keep climbing. It starts to level off, rocking side to side. The first officer desperately tries to counteract with the side stick. They're rapidly closing in on a fully developed stall. Now a stall happens when the wing moves beyond its critical angle of attack. At that point, it stops creating lift. The aircraft starts to fall. A stall can happen at any attitude. The only thing that determines it is angle of attack, the angle between the wing and the oncoming airflow. Both pilots had received training on stall recovery during their type ratings years ago. But they'd never experienced a fully developed stall in a real aircraft, and the Airbus only has an audio warning, no visual indication, no stick shaker. That might explain why they're not reacting to it, because when a human is under stress, one of the first things that disappears is hearing. At 2:10:57, 52 seconds into this, the aircraft reaches its stall angle of attack. Violent buffeting starts shaking the aircraft. This buffeting is much higher frequency than turbulence. It feels very different. The first officer adds full toga thrust, take off, go around thrust. But at this altitude, above the aircraft's maximum performance altitude, the engines can't produce enough thrust to even maintain speed, much less accelerate. The relief pilot calls out, "Above all, try to touch the lateral controls as little as possible." He's showing some understanding of the issues with alternate law. but the first officer keeps making maximum left and right inputs. The relief pilot says, "Is he coming or not?" referring to the captain. The first officer calls out, "I'm in toga," referring to the fact that he's added thrust. He might think that's enough to solve the situation. The aircraft climbs a few hundred feet more. It reaches its maximum altitude, 37,924 feet, and then it starts falling toward the sea below. Now you might ask, why didn't the relief pilot just take controls? He was asking for corrections that weren't happening. Well, we'll never know for sure, but it likely happened too fast. And the fact that he couldn't see or feel what his colleague was doing on the side stick, since those aren't connected in the Airbus, made it hard to monitor. At 2:11:07, the last bit of ice inside the pitot tubes clears. Both the standby and left airspeed indicators start working again. The speed shows 183 knots. They've lost 90 knots of airspeed. The aircraft is now in an increasingly rapid descent, with the stall warning sounding continuously. The relief pilot calls out, "But we've got the engines, what's happening?" Then, "Do you understand what's happening?" But he gets no reply. The aircraft starts banking right. The first officer gives continuous left side stick, but with very little effect. He also continues his pitch-up command. He's going to be doing that continuously for the next 40 seconds. Now, for those of you who can't believe the first officer could react this way, let me explain something. The human brain doesn't perform well under stress. We revert to our training. And here's the thing. The best climb performance you can get from an Airbus in normal law is achieved through continuous back pressure and toga thrust. That's what you use during a wind shear escape or terrain escape, because the aircraft won't let you stall. It'll pitch to maintain close to maximum angle of attack while using max thrust. Best possible performance. But that only works in normal law. If you apply that logic to alternate law, where the protections are gone, it's a recipe for disaster. Understanding that makes the first officer's actions maybe a little bit more understandable. Not right, but understandable. At 2:11:32, the first officer calls out that he doesn't have control anymore. No control at all. The relief pilot responds, "Controls to the left." He presses his takeover button. He makes 2 brief left inputs before the first officer takes back control and continues his own inputs, aft and left. None of it's working. At this point, their descent rate has increased to 10,000 feet per minute. The angle of attack is close to 40 degrees. The aircraft is more falling than flying. Because the angle of attack is so extreme, air is hitting the aircraft from below at a 40 to 60 degree angle. This causes a strange wind noise in the cockpit. But crucially, the angle that air is hitting the pitot tubes and static ports is so extreme that the pressures become almost equal. The speed indication disappears again. The computers interpret these conditions as impossible and unreliable. So from this point on, the lack of speed indication has nothing to do with ice. It's purely due to their extreme situation. Once the speed drops below 60 knots, the computers tell the stall warning system to disregard the angle of attack vanes because such a speed could only happen on the ground. The stall warning stops. As the calculated speed falls below 30 knots, speed flags replace the numbers on the displays. At this point, the first officer says something revealing. "I have the impression that we have the speed." It's unclear what he's basing this on. Maybe just his senses plus the wind noise outside and the buffeting. The silencing of the stall warning coincides with the captain returning to the cockpit at 2:11:42. That's 1.5 minutes after the autopilot disconnected, less than 1 minute after he was called. He's faced with a completely unrealistic scene. There's no stall warning for the reason I just explained, but the aircraft is descending with incredible vertical speed. They're passing 35,000 feet, the same altitude he left them at. The pitch is varying between 15 degrees nose up and 9 degrees nose down. There are 10 different warnings, master warning lights, severe buffeting shaking the aircraft. The captain asks, "What are you doing?" The relief pilot desperately answers, "What's happening?" "Well, I don't know. I don't know what's happening." The first officer chimes in, "We're losing control of the aircraft here." The relief pilot adds, "We've lost all control of the airplane. We don't understand anything. We've tried everything." The first officer reduces the engines to idle. This, along with some actual pitch-down commands, finally causes the aircraft to pitch down to about 11 degrees below the horizon. The first officer says, I have a problem. It's that I don't have vertical speed, I have no more displays. The relief pilot says, we have no valid indications. The vertical speed might be showing full down, or it might be missing. The computer would render anything above 20,000 feet per minute as invalid. But the fact that they're now pitching down causes the speed to start increasing and the angle of attack to decrease slightly. But in a cruel twist, because speed is increasing, the stall warning system notices it has valid indications again and starts sounding. So now you've got this perverse effect. The warning sounds when the nose is pitched down, but disappears when it pitches back up. This must be incredibly confusing, but it's fully in line with the system design at the time. The first officer says, I have the impression that we have some crazy speed. What do you think? He reaches over and deploys the speed brake, but is immediately told to stow it. This indicates that the first officer thinks they're in an overspeed, not the fully developed stall they're actually in. As the pilots try to troubleshoot, the aircraft is descending at 10 to 15,000 feet per minute. The nose is oscillating between 8 degrees down and 15 degrees up. Each time it pitches down, the stall warning activates. When it pitches up, it silences. The bank angle varies between 20 and 40 degrees, right? It's likely the yaw damper that's keeping them from going into a spin. At 2:12:10, thrust is moved back to the climb detent. 20 seconds later, the aircraft stops banking right and starts oscillating left and right, which the first officer continues trying to correct. The relief pilot asks the captain, "What do you think? What do we need to do?" The captain, who hasn't been informed about the nature of the initial failure or the rapid climb at the beginning, is completely perplexed. He just answers, "There, I don't know, there it's going down." He's clearly just trying to orient himself. In the following seconds, there are confused call-outs from all three pilots. The first officer asks, "Am I going down now?" The relief pilot responds, "Go down." The captain says, "No, you climb there," most likely referring to pitch attitude, not what the aircraft is actually doing. At some point, the first officer positions the side stick fully forward for a few seconds. This causes pitch down. Speed starts increasing. The stall warning comes back. The first officer confirms engines in toga. Again, this is his go-to response for the stall warning. He asks, "What do we have on alti?" referring to the altimeter, which is showing about 20,000 feet. This is strange, since he should be seeing his altitude in front of him. We can't be sure if the first officer had any valid instruments, since the recorder didn't capture his side. But later examinations seem to indicate he did. The captain mutters, "It's impossible." He still can't figure out what's happening. During the following seconds, the pilots keep discussing attitude and how to level the wings. The confusion is obvious and excruciating. The first officer explains he's at the limit with roll controls. The captain suggests using left rudder to stop the right bank. This actually helps momentarily. The aircraft rolls slightly left but soon continues banking right again. They pass through 10,000 feet. The first officer calls out, we're there, we're passing level 100." At this point, there's very little they could do to save this aircraft, but the relief pilot calls out, "Wait, me, I have controls." He starts making left inputs, but the first officer never lets go of his control. The warning, dual input, is heard multiple times. The first officer calls out, "How come we're continuing to go down?" As he's saying this, the relief pilot tells the captain to try resetting the flight control computers. The captain does, but says it won't make any difference. The relief pilot starts calling out, "Climb! Climb! Climb!" The first officer responds, "But I've been at max nose up for a while." That last remark finally makes the captain understand what's going on. He calls out, "No, no, no, don't climb!" The relief pilot says, "So go down," and pushes his stick forward. But the first officer is still holding his stick back, causing another dual input warning. Since the inputs are averaged, nothing happens. The relief pilot calls out, "So give me the controls, controls to me, controls to me." The first officer responds, "Go ahead, you have the controls. We're still in toga." The nose lowers 7 degrees below the horizon. Speed indication comes back. Another stall warning. 7 seconds later, despite having given controls away, the first officer starts pulling back again, another dual input alert. The thrust levers are pulled to idle, then pushed forward again, probably trying to achieve any type of change. The captain calls out, "Watch out, you're pitching up there." But the relief pilot seems to have changed his mind about strategy. He calls out, "I'm pitching up, I'm pitching up." When the captain continues to warn about this, he responds, "Well, we need to do it." We're at 4,000 feet. The next thing on the recorder is the GPWS. Sink rate, pull up. They're falling through 2,500 feet. This causes the captain to change his mind too. He calls out, "Go on, pull!" The first officer chimes in, "Let's go, pull up, pull up, pull up." Both pilots pull maximum back. The nose pitches up to 16 degrees above the horizon. Speed is 107 knots forward, but vertical speed is 107 knots downward. At 2:14:22, the first officer presses his takeover button and holds it. This locks out the relief pilot's controls. The voice recorder calls out, "Priority right." The first officer pulls back in panic. "Damn, we're going to crash," followed by, "This can't be true, and what's happening?" The captain barks out, 10 degrees pitch up. The stall and GPWS warnings are blaring. The relief pilot tries one last time to pitch forward, but since the first officer is holding the takeover button, his inputs have no effect. Even if they would, it's far too late. At 2:14:28, the Airbus A330 crashes into the Atlantic Ocean at a 45-degree angle and a vertical speed of 10,900 feet per minute. The forces are equivalent to being dropped from the 46th floor of a building straight into concrete. The aircraft shatters into thousands of pieces. All 228 people on board are killed instantly. Completely unaware of this, the 4 ATC centers that were supposed to be in contact with the flight start contacting each other. Has anyone heard from 4 and 47? It soon becomes clear there's been no contact since 1:35 a.m. The crew hasn't checked in at position checkpoints. Since HF radio problems aren't uncommon over the Atlantic, no one takes particular notice for the first few hours. There are continued calls between ATC centers. Other aircraft on the same route are asked to try contacting the flight. No success. They try SATCOM, satellite telephone. They try data messages from Air France. Nothing. 3 hours after the accident, the flight is registered as missing. 3 hours after that, the first emergency messages go out from Madrid and Senegal. Search and rescue planes head toward the last known position. On June 2, 2009, 2 days after the accident, the first floating debris is spotted. 3 days later, the first remains of victims are recovered. This is the beginning of a 2-year search effort. They chart the entire underwater terrain in the area where the aircraft is thought to have gone down. The search is divided into several campaigns. The last one starts in March 2011. On April 2, 2011, the wreckage is finally located on a relatively flat area of the sea floor at a depth of 12,800 feet, 6.5 miles from its last transmitted position. Thousands of pieces are recovered, including both the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder. Miraculously, they're in good condition. The fact that both recorders are found is what finally allows the complete story to be told. So what conclusions did the final report bring? Why did this horrible accident happen? Well, here's the thing. No component on the aircraft actually failed. The pitot tubes and their heating elements were temporarily overwhelmed by external factors, ice crystals, that were likely outside what they'd been certified for. This led to loss of reliable airspeed. That caused a cascade of system degradations, warnings, and autopilot disconnection that severely startled the crew. The crew was expected to apply the unreliable airspeed procedure. They never did. Instead, the initial pitch-up reaction by the pilot flying led to a continuously worsening energy situation. The subsequent corrections were too small. The aircraft exited the flight envelope and entered a sustained stall. This fact was not understood by the pilots, most likely due to lack of training, but possibly also because they thought the warning was erroneous. It didn't match their mental model of what was happening. The stall condition was never discussed or verbalized during the entire sequence. The lack of identification meant no countermeasures were initiated. This accident sent shockwaves through the aviation industry. It led to several safety recommendations, including the formation of formal upset prevention and recovery training for all pilots. That includes high-altitude flying effects and stall recoveries. It also led to new memory items for unreliable airspeed, focused on disconnecting automatics and setting correct pitch and power immediately, before troubleshooting. The investigation recommended cameras in cockpits to show all instruments. improvements to pitot probes and black boxes, changes to the Airbus stall warning system, and search and rescue improvements. But the most important lessons for us pilots: we really need to understand the aircraft we're flying. That means understanding all the systems, what happens when those systems are degraded, and how the aircraft might react differently at high versus low altitude. And never forget to continue flying the aircraft. If a startle happens, remember, pitch and power will keep you safe. Keep the aircraft flying. Only after that, try to figure out what happened. As long as the aircraft is flying, there's plenty of time to troubleshoot. Look, my friend, this story was based on the accident final report, but due to its complexity and the many human factors involved, I also used several other sources. I want to especially mention Understanding Air France 447-1 by Bill Palmer, which was instrumental in helping me understand the Airbus A330 systems. Highly recommend it. If you enjoyed today's episode and want to see more stories like this, I suggest you check out this video right here about another high-altitude disaster that changed aviation forever. This is Captain Peter Mercer. Thanks for being my co-pilot on this one. See you on the next flight.